Everyone assumes The Simpsons is still the sharp, character-driven show it was in the 90s. Family Guy gets called the copycat, the one that stole its formula. But the writers who built that formula admit something different happened. In this video, we break down why The Simpsons is slowly turning into Family Guy. Two shows, one blueprint. The Simpsons started small. Matt Groening created the family as short cartoon segments for The Tracey Ullman Show, a sketch comedy program that aired on Fox starting in 1987. Groening had actually been called into a meeting with producers hoping to adapt his existing comic strip, Life in Hell, into animated shorts for the same program. But rather than hand over the rights to that strip, he sketched out an entirely new family in the waiting room just before the meeting began. He gave the characters the same first names as members of his own real family, naming the father Homer and the mother Marge after his own parents, and naming the two daughters Lisa and Maggie after his own sisters. The one name that broke this pattern belonged to the son, Bart, whose name works as a rearrangement of the letters in the word brat. Those early shorts were rough-looking, only a minute or two long, and mostly built around simple jokes about a chaotic household. Across the run of The Tracey Ullman Show, Groening and his team produced 48 of these short segments, refining the family bit by bit with each new batch. Nobody watching those early clips could have guessed that this odd little cartoon family would eventually become one of the most successful shows in the history of American television. By December of 1989, Fox gave the Simpson family their own half-hour show, debuting with a Christmas special called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire on December 17th of that year. From that point on, the series grew into something much bigger than anyone at the network expected, quickly becoming the highest-rated show on the entire Fox network during its first full season on the air. Homer Simpson, the father of the family, works at the Springfield nuclear power plant, a job that gave the writers endless material to joke about, since Homer is careless, easily distracted, and often falls asleep at his post. His boss, Montgomery Burns, became one of the most memorable villains in television comedy, an old, wealthy man who treats his workers as replaceable and barely remembers Homer's name after years of him working there. Burns is rarely seen without his assistant Waylon Smithers close by, a devoted employee whose constant attempts to please his boss became one of the show's most consistent running jokes. Marge Simpson, Homer's wife, holds the household together and acts as the emotional center of the family, often being the only person paying attention while everyone else spirals into some new disaster. Their children rounded out the family in ways that felt new for television at the time. Bart Simpson became a symbol of rebellious kids everywhere, a 10-year-old who skateboards through school hallways, prank calls Moe's Tavern, and treats authority figures as targets rather than people to respect. His best friend, Milhouse Van Houten, gave Bart a steady sidekick throughout the show's history, a nervous, glasses-wearing kid who usually goes along with whatever scheme Bart comes up with, even when it clearly leads to trouble. Bart's other regular foil, a bully named Nelson Muntz, became known for his signature laugh aimed at anyone who suffers a small humiliation in front of him. Lisa Simpson, Bart's younger sister, became almost the opposite of Bart, a bright, thoughtful child who plays the saxophone, cares about the environment, and often feels like the only person in Springfield who notices when something is wrong with the world around her. Even baby Maggie, who almost never speaks, became a running joke of her own, always seen sucking on a pacifier while chaos unfolds around her. Beyond the immediate family, The Simpsons built an entire town full of characters that felt just as important as the main cast. Moe Sislak runs Moe's Tavern, a rundown bar where Homer spends countless evenings drinking Duff beer, a fictional brand that became one of the most recognized running jokes in the show's history. Moe himself became known for his miserable outlook on life, his terrible luck with women, and his tendency to snap at the regulars who hang around his bar every night, including Homer's close friend, Barney Gumble, a good-natured but constantly drunk regular who somehow still manages to hold his life together in small, unexpected ways. Ned Flanders, The Simpsons' neighbor, became known for his relentless positivity and deep religious devotion, standing in total contrast to Homer's laziness and short temper. Principal Skinner, who runs Springfield Elementary School, became the perfect example of a stiff, overly formal authority figure, a man who takes every minor disruption as as a serious threat to order, giving Bart endless opportunities to undermine him. The town also includes Apu Nahasapimapetalon, who runs the Quick E-Mart convenience store and somehow manages to work an impossible number of hours without ever seeming to leave his post behind the counter. Chief Wiggum leads the Springfield Police Department, a role built entirely around the joke that he is lazy, easily distracted by food, and generally incompetent at solving any real crime. Krusty the Clown hosts a children's television show inside the world of The Simpsons, giving the writers a way to poke fun at cheap, corner-cutting children's programming, while his one-time sidekick-turned-rival, Sideshow Bob, eventually became one of the show's most enduring villains, a former television clown driven by a bitter grudge against Bart specifically. These characters, along with dozens of others living in Springfield, gave the show a depth that very few cartoons before it had ever attempted. Instead of a small handful of characters carrying every episode, The Simpsons built an entire functioning town, one that felt lived in no matter which street corner or building the story happened to visit that week. What made The Simpsons different from cartoons that came before it was the way it blended sharp humor with real emotional weight. Episodes could be silly and full of exaggerated cartoon logic one moment, then turn quietly sad or thoughtful the next. A storyline about Homer forgetting an important family event could suddenly turn into something surprisingly tender by the end, without ever feeling like the tone had been broken. This mix of comedy and heart became one of the biggest reasons the show connected with such a wide audience. Adults could watch it and pick up on cultural references, political jokes, and social commentary, while younger viewers could still enjoy the more obvious slapstick and cartoon antics happening on the surface. Very few shows before it had managed to work on that many levels at once, and that balancing act became the foundation the entire show was built on. Because The Simpsons became such a massive hit, it did not take long before other networks and other creators started looking at it as a model to follow. If a cartoon about an ordinary, flawed family living in an ordinary American town could become one of the biggest shows on television, then surely a similar formula could work again somewhere else. Over the years, a number of shows tried to build their own version of that setup. Some of them respected where the idea came from and gave The Simpsons credit for paving the way. Others leaned much harder into direct comparison, building shows so close to the original blueprint that audiences immediately noticed the resemblance. One of the clearest examples of this came from a young animator named Seth MacFarlane. Before Family Guy ever existed, MacFarlane made small student films while studying animation, including a short about a middle-aged man and his talking dog having plain, everyday conversations. Fox executives saw potential in that concept and eventually helped MacFarlane grow it into a full-length television show. By the time Family Guy premiered on Fox in 1999, it followed a structure that felt extremely familiar to anyone who had been watching The Simpsons for the past decade. A working-class father with poor judgment and a good heart. A wife trying to hold the household together despite her husband's antics. A group of children who each represented a different type of kid. A talking family pet who acted more like an adult than the family members around him. None of these pieces were invented by Family Guy. Every one of them had already been established by The Simpsons years earlier. Even smaller details lined up in ways that were hard to ignore. Homer Simpson had Moe's Tavern as his escape from home life, a bar with a miserable bartender who doubled as his emotional outlet whenever things went wrong. Family Guy gave Peter Griffin a nearly identical setup at a bar called The Drunken Clam, complete with its own bartender character who existed for the same basic purpose. Springfield Elementary had Principal Skinner, a stiff and overly formal school administrator who treated every disruption like a serious threat. Family Guy created its own version of that role through Principal Shepard, a similar authority figure built around the same basic joke. Even something as small as the beer Homer drinks became part of this pattern. Duff Beer had already become one of the most recognized fictional products in television by the time Family Guy introduced Pawtucket Patriot Ale, a beer brand tied to Peter Griffin's job that mirrored Duff in almost every function within the show. These similarities were noticed almost immediately once Family Guy began airing, and neither show ever pretended the comparison did not exist. In one especially direct moment, Peter Griffin, while drunk, admits out loud that his own show show stole a lot of ideas from The Simpsons. It is an unusual thing for any television series to write into its own script, since most shows would rather stay quiet about a comparison like that instead of pointing straight at it. The writers at The Simpsons noticed the same overlap from the other side, and they brought it up more than once over the years. The first time Peter Griffin showed up inside an episode of The Simpsons came during Treehouse of Horror 13, the Halloween-themed episode that opened the show's 14th season in 2002. One segment inside that episode follows Homer discovering a way to clone himself, and as the camera pans across a yard full of Homer copies, one of the clones standing among them is drawn as Peter Griffin instead of Homer, a quick, easy-to-miss joke suggesting that Peter was simply another version of Homer to begin with. A few years later, the writers returned to the same idea in a much more direct way. In an episode called The Italian Bob, which aired on December 11, 2005, as part of the show's 17th season, the plot follows the Simpson family traveling to Italy after a car belonging to Mr. Burns gets damaged, eventually running into Sideshow Bob, who has been living quietly in an Italian village under a new identity. When local police pull out a book used to identify wanted criminals from the United States, the pages flip past a photograph of Peter Griffin, labeled with the Italian word for plagiarism, followed immediately afterward by a photograph of Stan Smith, a character from the animated series American Dad, labeled with a phrase translating to plagiarism of plagiarism, since American Dad had itself been created by Seth MacFarlane following the success of Family Guy. Taken together, these two jokes, spaced 3 years apart, made clear that the writers of The Simpsons had noticed the comparison between the two shows early on, and were willing to make that comparison part of the joke themselves, rather than ignoring it or pretending the overlap did not exist. This connection between the two shows eventually stopped being just a running joke, and became something the writers themselves decided to address head-on. In 2014, The Simpsons and Family Guy crossed paths in an episode called The Simpsons Guy, which aired as part of Family Guy's 13th season. The story followed the Griffin family getting stranded near Springfield after their car gets stolen, forcing Peter, Lois, and their kids to spend time living alongside Homer, Marge, and their children. Rather than avoid the years of comparison between the two shows, the writers built the entire episode around it. At one point, the plot uses the beer comparison directly, revealing that Peter's employer, the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, had been selling an unauthorized copy of Duff beer this entire time, forcing Peter into a courtroom over it. It was one of the clearest moments in either show's history where the writers openly admitted, inside the story itself, that Family Guy had built much of its world using pieces first created by The Simpsons. The episode itself was written entirely by the Family Guy writing staff, rather than the team behind The Simpsons, though producers from Springfield's side reviewed and adjusted a handful of lines before it aired. One person made that entire arrangement possible. Richard Appel had spent 4 seasons as a writer and producer on The Simpsons before eventually moving over to Family Guy, where he became an executive producer. Because Appel had earned the trust of Simpsons producers like Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, and Al Jean during his time working on the show, he was able to bring the idea of a crossover directly to them, and they agreed to let Family Guy's team handle the characters however they wanted, without worrying about strict continuity between the two shows. Looking back at everything Family Guy borrowed from The Simpsons, from the family structure down to the smallest running jokes, it becomes clear just how much influence Springfield had over the shape of animated comedy going forward. The Simpsons did not simply create a hit show. It created a formula so effective that other creators spent years building their own versions of it, sometimes respectfully, sometimes almost too closely for comfort. What makes this history worth understanding is not just how much Family Guy copied from The Simpsons, but what happens later, once the show that inspired an entire genre starts being accused of turning into the very thing it once inspired. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That shift did not happen overnight, and it did not happen because of one single episode or one single season. It built slowly, over years, through changes in tone, changes in plot structure, and changes in how the writers chose to build their jokes. Understanding what that shift actually looked like and why so many longtime viewers started noticing it means looking closely at exactly when people first started calling The Simpsons something very different from the show they remembered. Section 2. The Cutaway Gag Divide. To understand how people started saying The Simpsons was turning into Family Guy, it helps to understand exactly what made the two shows different in the first place. The most obvious difference sits in how each show builds its jokes, and that difference comes down to something called a cutaway gag. A cutaway gag is a joke that jumps away from whatever is happening in the main scene, shows a completely separate moment that has nothing to do with the plot, gets its laugh, and then jumps right back to where the story left off. The character usually says something that triggers the jump, something like a comparison to a past event, and instead of just describing that event out loud, the show cuts to it, plays it out fully, and then returns to the conversation as if nothing happened. Family Guy built its entire comedic identity around this device from its earliest seasons. One of the clearest examples of this style is the running fight between Peter Griffin and a giant chicken named Ernie. The joke started small, with Peter running into Ernie over an expired coupon, leading to a short scuffle. Over the years, that fight became one of the show's most famous recurring bits, growing longer and more elaborate every time it appeared, with Peter and the chicken smashing through entire buildings, crashing through city streets, and destroying property across town, all without any real explanation tying it back into whatever episode it happened to interrupt. The fight has no memory of previous fights, no consequences that carry into future episodes, and no real connection to anything else happening in the story. It exists purely as a standalone joke that the show can drop into an episode whenever the writers want a big visual gag, then walk away from completely once it ends. This same pattern shows up constantly throughout Family Guy in smaller ways too. Peter often says a line like this reminds him of the time something happened, and the show cuts to a scene showing exactly that thing, usually something absurd, sometimes involving celebrities, historical figures, or made-up situations that could never have actually happened. These cutaways rarely connect back to the plot in any meaningful way once they end. The show simply returns to the original scene and continues as though the detour never happened. Over time, this style became one of the most recognizable traits of Family Guy, something audiences came to expect, and something critics pointed to constantly when discussing the show's structure. The Simpsons built its comedy on a very different foundation, especially during its most celebrated years. Rather than jumping away from the plot for unrelated jokes, the classic era of the show tied its humor directly into the story being told that week. If Homer got himself into trouble, the jokes usually came from watching him deal with the fallout of his own decisions, not from a random detour into an unrelated scene. A famous example of this comes from the episode where Homer becomes overweight on purpose so he can qualify for a disability that lets him work from home. Following a series of health tests, cafeteria binges, and doctor visits that all connect logically to the choice he made at the start of the episode. Even when the plots became wild or exaggerated, like Homer becoming an astronaut, or Homer starting his own band, or Homer accidentally causing a nuclear meltdown scare at the plant, the jokes stayed rooted in cause and effect. One decision led to the next, and the humor came from watching that chain of events play out, rather than from cutting away to something completely disconnected from what came before. This difference in structure became one of the most talked about points of comparison between the two shows, once critics and fans started weighing them against each other. A summary of the criticism aimed at Family Guy points directly at this issue. Critics repeatedly singled out the show's heavy reliance on cutaway gags as a weakness, arguing that this style came at the cost of strong characterization and consistent storytelling, and that the show leaned too hard on pop culture references stacked one after another, instead of building jokes around who the characters actually were. This criticism often placed Family Guy in direct comparison with The Simpsons and with South Park, two shows widely seen as doing more with character and story, instead of leaning on constant detours for laughs. South Park did not just get compared to Family Guy by critics from the outside. The show's creators, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, addressed the comparison directly directly inside their own series, and they did it in a way that became one of the most famous examples of one animated show openly criticizing another. In 2006, South Park aired a two-part episode called Cartoon Wars, which used its plot to take direct aim at Family Guy's cutaway style. Inside the story, the show depicts Family Guy's jokes as being generated by a tank full of manatees, each one pushing a ball with a random word or idea printed on it into a slot, with the resulting combination of random words then getting stitched together into a cutaway joke, regardless of whether the pieces made any real sense together. This depiction was clearly a piece of fictional satire rather than a literal claim about how the real Family Guy writers worked, but the message behind the joke was impossible to miss. South Park was accusing Family Guy of building its humor from randomness rather than from character or story logic, picking whatever reference felt funny in the moment and forcing it into the show, regardless of whether it earned its place. The timing of Cartoon Wars mattered just as much as its content. The two-part episode was partly a response to a real controversy involving a planned image of the religious figure Muhammad, something Fox had restricted from being shown in an episode of Family Guy around that same period. South Park had been dealing with its own long-running battle over depicting Muhammad in earlier episodes, and Cartoon Wars used that shared controversy as the backdrop for its critique, blending real-world network censorship issues with a fictional storyline about which show deserved the freedom to push boundaries. Inside that same two-part story, South Park's creators included a moment that stood out to critics and fans alike. The episode acknowledged, through its own characters, that The Simpsons held a level of respect and creative standing that South Park did not consider itself equal to, treating Springfield's show as the more established and more polished production, even while South Park spent much of the same episode tearing into Family Guy for its writing style. That single moment drew a clear line for viewers. One long-running animated show was willing to openly criticize another for leaning on cutaways and random references, while at the same time treating The Simpsons as an example of a show that still built its comedy the right way, through character and story rather than disconnected detours. Family Guy's relationship with Fox during its early years adds another layer to this history that matters for understanding the timeline. The show premiered in 1999 and ran for a few seasons before Fox actually canceled it in 2002 due to low ratings, pulling the show off the air entirely. It would have stayed canceled if not for what happened next. Reruns of the show found a strong audience on Adult Swim, the late-night programming block on Cartoon Network aimed at older viewers, and DVD sales of the early seasons performed far better than anyone at Fox expected. Seeing how much demand there still was for the show, Fox brought Family Guy back in 2005, giving it new episodes and a second chance that very few canceled shows ever get. This means Family Guy's real rise in popularity did not happen during its original run in the early 2000s, but a few years later, right around the same period when The Simpsons had already been on the air for well over a decade and had started facing its own questions from longtime fans about whether the show still had the same sharpness it once did. These two timelines running side by side matter because they set up the exact period when comparisons between the two shows started shifting from simple similarity in family structure towards something much more pointed, with critics and fans beginning to ask whether the show that inspired an entire genre was starting to borrow from the very show it had once inspired. The core argument critics made about cutaway gags goes beyond simply saying the jokes are random. It touches on something deeper about how a show handles its own plot. When a story relies on cause and effect, the writers have to actually deal with consequences. A character makes a choice, that choice creates a problem, and the show has to find a way to resolve that problem by the end of the episode, ideally in a way that says something honest about who that character is. Cutaway gags let a show avoid that responsibility entirely. Instead of building toward a real resolution, the writers can simply insert a joke that has nothing to do with the plot, get a laugh from it, and then return to the story without ever really dealing with whatever tension the episode set up. Critics who favored The Simpsons often pointed to this exact issue when explaining why they felt Family Guy's humor, while sometimes very funny in isolated isolated moments did not hold together the same way a Simpsons episode from its classic years did. A cutaway can be funny on its own, but it does not require the writers to say anything true about the characters involved, since it exists completely outside the story they are supposedly telling. This is not to say The Simpsons never used quick jokes or short visual gags that stepped slightly outside the main plot. The show had plenty of background jokes, visual sight gags hidden in the corners of a scene, and quick one-line jabs that did not always connect directly to the episode's central story. What set the classic seasons apart was how rarely the show built an entire episode around detours like that. The core plot almost always stayed front and center, with side jokes acting as seasoning rather than the main course. Family Guy flipped that balance. The main plot in many episodes became almost secondary to the cutaways themselves, sometimes existing mostly as a loose frame the writers could hang random jokes onto, rather than the actual engine driving the humor forward. Understanding this difference matters because it sets up everything that came later in the ongoing conversation between fans of both shows. Once people had a clear sense of what made each show tick, structurally and creatively, they had a real basis for comparison whenever either show changed its approach over time. If The Simpsons ever started leaning harder into random detours, celebrity-heavy jokes disconnected from its own plots, or humor that existed just to exist rather than to reveal something about its characters, that shift would stand out immediately to anyone who understood the show's roots. And that is exactly the kind of shift that fans, critics, and even some of the show's own writers eventually started pointing to, years after The Simpsons had already cemented itself as one of the most respected comedies in television history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Fans who had grown up watching the show's earliest years eventually started using a specific term to describe what they felt had happened to the series they once loved. That term would go on to define an entire ongoing debate among viewers, critics, and even some of the people who worked on the show. What that term actually means and where it came from is where the story goes next. Section 3. The Rise of Zombie Simpsons. Sometime during the 2000s, a certain kind of Simpsons fan started using a very specific phrase to describe what they felt had happened to their favorite show. That phrase was Zombie Simpsons. It was not an official term used by Fox or by the people who worked on the show. It came from fans and critics who had grown up on the earliest seasons of The Simpsons and felt that the version airing now barely resembled what they remembered. The idea behind the name was simple and a little harsh. A zombie is something that used to be alive, that looks like it is still moving and still functioning, but is missing whatever made it truly alive in the first place. Fans who used this term were saying that The Simpsons had technically kept running season after season, but that the spark, the sharpness, and the heart that made the earlier years so beloved had been replaced by something hollow, wearing the same familiar faces. The term is closely tied to a website called Dead Homer Society, which became the most well-known home for this kind of criticism. The site was run by a writer using the name Charlie Sweatpants, who spent years publishing detailed breakdowns of individual Simpsons episodes, comparing them against the show's earlier seasons, and explaining exactly where he felt the writing had gone wrong. Rather than simply saying later seasons were worse in a general sense, the site tried to point at specific patterns. It argued that episodes had become more reliant on loud, exaggerated plots instead of grounded family situations. It pointed to characters acting in ways that felt disconnected from who they used to be, doing things purely because a joke required it, rather than because it made sense for that person to behave that way. It also argued that the show leaned harder on outside celebrities showing up as guest voices, sometimes built entirely around a joke tied to who that celebrity was, rather than anything actually happening inside Springfield. One of the most detailed pieces to come out of this website was a long essay called Zombie Simpsons: How the Best Show Ever Became the Broadcasting Undead. It was written as a kind of mini-book, broken into chapters, tracing the show's full history from its earliest days as an unexpected hit through what the writer considered its slow decline into something he described as a hollow shell of what it used to be. The essay argued that the show had gone from being something that actively changed the direction of American television comedy to something that mostly repeated its own old habits minutes without the same energy behind them. It used strong language throughout, describing the modern show as over-animated, under-thought out, and mediocre, and argued that the show would have been better served by ending years earlier rather than continuing to air new episodes long after its creative peak had passed. One specific example the essay pointed to was the show's 500th episode, which aired in 2012. That episode involved the Simpson family being kicked out of Springfield after other residents grew tired of their behavior. Critics pointed to this episode as a clear symbol of what zombie Simpsons fans meant when they talked about the show's decline. Instead of a grounded story about a specific problem the family caused and had to fix, the plot involved the entire town turning against them in a way that felt more like a broad, exaggerated premise built to justify a big milestone episode, rather than something that grew naturally out of who these characters actually were. For fans who grew up on episodes built around small, believable family conflicts, watching an entire town banish the Simpsons felt like exactly the kind of oversized, cartoonish plot they associated with the show's later years. It is worth being clear that Zombie Simpsons was never a term embraced by everyone who watched the show. It came specifically from a smaller, more vocal group of longtime fans who cared enough about the series to closely track its changes over time, and who felt strongly enough about those changes to build an entire website around documenting them. Plenty of viewers continued watching new episodes without ever hearing this term, and plenty of others who did hear it disagreed with how harsh the criticism could get. Some fans who used the term openly admitted that arguing with people who defended the newer seasons could be difficult, since defenders often responded by saying that taste in comedy changes over time, or that older seasons only feel better because of nostalgia rather than because they were actually written any differently. Still, the term stuck around for years and became a common shorthand whenever fans wanted to talk about the gap between the show's celebrated early seasons and its much longer, more heavily debated later era. The criticism connected to Zombie Simpsons often reached back further than people expected. Some fans traced the earliest signs of change all the way back to around season 5, noting that even then, small pockets of viewers on early internet forums had already started complaining that something felt slightly off compared to the first few years. At that point, the complaints were often extremely minor, sometimes focused on tiny details like the timing of a joke or a small inconsistency in a background gag. Looking back at those early complaints years later, some fans admitted that many of them were fairly nitpicky compared to what would eventually be considered a real decline in quality. The show was still widely considered excellent throughout most of the 1990s, but those early complaints show that questions about where the show was heading existed much earlier than most casual viewers would guess, even if those questions did not turn into a wider, more serious conversation until years later. That wider conversation really started to build once the show moved into its second decade on the air, sometime around the late 1990s and early 2000s. Fans who continued watching through this period have pointed to specific episodes from around season 11 as moments where the shift became harder to ignore. Two episodes often mentioned by fans from this stretch involve storylines that leaned much further into absurd, exaggerated territory than the show's earlier seasons typically had. One centers on Homer and Bart building a homemade roller coaster in their backyard, and the other involves the family adopting an alligator that ends up loose in their home. For fans who had grown up on episodes built around smaller, more grounded situations, storylines like these felt like a clear signal that the writers were leaning harder into big, cartoonish premises rather than staying close to realistic family situations. Some fans who had continued watching through this period later said that comparing these episodes to other adult animated shows airing at the same time, particularly Futurama, made the shift in tone and sharpness even more obvious to them, since Futurama was airing new episodes around this same period, and many fans felt it maintained a stronger connection to character-driven storytelling. By the time the show reached its 14th season, some longtime viewers had essentially given up hope that the sharper, more grounded style of the earlier years would return. Looking back at this period, fans who had followed the show from its earliest days often said that seasons from this era blurred together in their memory, forming what one fan described as one large, largely nearly forgettable stretch of episodes that lacked the individual personality each season used to carry. This stands in contrast to how vividly many fans remember specific seasons from the 1990s, often able to recall entire storylines, specific jokes, and specific character moments from those years, even decades later. The fact that later seasons did not leave the same kind of lasting impression became, for many critics, one of the clearest signs that something fundamental had changed in how the show was being written. Some critics who examined this decline made an interesting comparison to help explain just how unusual it was. Most long-running television shows, once they pass a certain number of seasons, tend to hit a noticeable turning point where quality drops off, often tied to a specific change, like a major cast member leaving or the show running out of natural story ideas. Critics have pointed to shows like The X-Files, which many felt lost some of its energy once one of its two lead actors, David Duchovny, reduced his role in later seasons. Older television also has its own well-known examples of shows introducing new characters late in their run in an attempt to keep things fresh, sometimes replacing beloved original cast members, with mixed results. The classic example often cited is The Brady Bunch adding a young cousin character partway through its run as the original child actors grew older, a moment many television historians point to as an example of a show visibly straining to maintain its original formula. Critics writing about The Simpsons argued that the show broke this usual pattern in an unusual way. Rather than experiencing one clear turning point tied to a specific cast change or a specific creative decision, the show seemed to decline gradually across many years, without ever having an obvious single moment audiences could point to and say, that is exactly where things changed. This slow, gradual nature of the shift is part of why the Zombie Simpsons label became so widely discussed rather than fading quickly. If the show had clearly declined all at once, tied to one specific season or one specific staffing change, it would have been easier for fans to simply mark that point and move on, either continuing to watch out of habit or dropping the show entirely. Instead, the change crept in slowly enough that many viewers kept watching for years without fully registering how different the show had become compared to where it started. Only when looking back at long stretches of episodes side by side did the shift become fully visible, which is part of why so much of the writing and discussion around Zombie Simpsons involves close, detailed comparisons between specific early episodes and specific later ones, rather than simple, broad statements about quality dropping. Writers covering this topic for larger publications picked up on this same idea years later, describing a small but vocal group of fans who actively wanted the show canceled, tracing the decline back specifically to the late 1990s. These same writers pointed directly to Dead Homer Society as the central hub for this kind of criticism, quoting some of the site's harshest language, describing the modern show as a hollow shell of what it used to be, both over-animated and under-thought out. These articles also acknowledge that, despite this vocal criticism from longtime fans, The Simpsons continued running new episodes for years afterward, eventually becoming one of the longest-running scripted television shows in American history, a fact that only added fuel to the ongoing argument between fans who felt the show should have ended long ago and fans who continued watching and defending its newer seasons, regardless of how they compared to the earlier years. It is worth noting that criticism like this is not unique to The Simpsons. Almost every long-running television show eventually faces some version of this same argument from its most dedicated fans, since maintaining the exact same quality and freshness across decades of new material is an extremely difficult task for any creative team. What makes the Zombie Simpsons discussion stand out is simply how organized and detailed the criticism became, with an entire website dedicated to breaking down specific episodes rather than just offering vague complaints, and how long the debate has continued, stretching across more than 2 decades of ongoing discussion among fans who clearly still care deeply about the show, even while arguing that it lost something important along the way. Understanding this decline matters directly for the larger question this video is built around. Once a show starts drifting away from the grounded, character-driven storytelling that made it famous, the door opens for other influences to creep in, including styles borrowed from shows that came after it. If The Simpsons had simply kept its early, disciplined approach to storytelling throughout its entire run, there would be far less room for anyone to argue that it started resembling a show built on a completely different comedic foundation. But once critics and fans agreed that something had shifted, the next question became obvious. What exactly was that shift turning the show into, and why did so many people specifically compare that change to Family Guy rather than to any other show airing at the same time? Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Some of the most direct answers to that question did not come from outside critics or from fan-run websites. They came from people who had actually worked on The Simpsons themselves, including longtime writers who spent years inside the writer's room and had a front-row seat to how the show's approach changed over time. Their comments, given years after the fact in interviews and public appearances, offer a very different kind of insight into this same debate, one that comes from first-hand experience rather than outside observation. Section 4. Even the writers noticed. Outside criticism from fans and critics is one thing. It is easy for anyone to say a show lost its way after they no longer feel connected to it, since audiences change just as much as television shows do. What makes this part of the story different is that some of the strongest comments about how The Simpsons changed over the years did not come from outside observers at all. They came from people who spent years actually sitting in the writer's room, working on the scripts, shaping the jokes, and deciding which stories would make it to air. Their comments carry a different kind of weight because these are people who watch the change happen from the inside, season after season, rather than people simply comparing old episodes to new ones from a distance. One of the most important people in this part of the story is Mike Reiss. Reiss joined The Simpsons during its earliest years and became one of the show's original writers, working alongside a small team that helped shape the series during its first handful of seasons. He eventually became co-showrunner during seasons 3 and 4, sharing that role with another longtime writer named Al Jean. Together, Reiss and Jean helped guide the show through some of what many fans consider its strongest creative years, a period when the series built much of the reputation it still carries today. Reiss did not simply leave the show after his run as showrunner ended. He continued working in television afterward, taking on other projects, but he stayed connected to The Simpsons for decades, returning at various points to consult on scripts and offer input even long after he stopped running the writer's room day to day. Because Reiss had this long, ongoing relationship with the show, spanning from its very beginning all the way through its later decades, his comments about how the series changed carry a kind of authority that outside critics simply cannot match. He was not comparing the show from memory or from watching old reruns. He had lived through the actual writing process across almost the entire run of the series, watching firsthand how the approach to jokes, plots, and characters shifted year after year. In 2010, Reiss spoke to a group of college students in New York City. During that appearance, someone asked him directly about the show's declining quality, a question he must have heard some version of many times over the years by that point. Rather than deny that anything had changed, Reiss gave an answer that became one of the most quoted comments in the entire debate about the show's direction. He compared The Simpsons to an aging grandparent, saying that people change the same way shows change, and that grandparents typically go one of two ways as they get older. They either become more boring, or they become crazy and weird. Reiss said he liked to think The Simpsons had gone the second route, becoming crazy and weird rather than boring. At first glance, this comment sounds like a light-hearted joke, the kind of thing a longtime writer might say to get a laugh out of a room full of college students. Looking closer at what he actually said reveals something much more direct. Reiss was not arguing that the show had stayed the same, or that criticism of its later seasons was unfair. He was openly admitting that the show had changed significantly from what it used to be, and he was choosing a framework to describe that change rather than deny it. Comparing a television show to a senile grandparent, especially a show that spent years making jokes about elderly characters losing their grip on reality, is not exactly a strong defense of quality. It reads more like an admission wrapped inside a joke, a way of acknowledging the criticism without directly confirming every specific complaint fans had been making for years. The word crazy and weird also lines up closely with one of the most common criticisms fans and critics had already been making about the show's later seasons. Zombie Simpsons critics frequently complained that plots had become more outlandish and less grounded compared to the earlier years, moving away from believable family situations toward bigger, stranger premises built more around a wild concept than around real character behavior. Reese, using the exact words crazy and weird to describe the show's evolution, matches this criticism almost perfectly, even though he was framing it as a positive rather than a flaw. Whether a person views that shift as exciting or as a decline likely depends on which era of the show they grew up watching, but the fact that a former showrunner used language this close to what critics had already been saying for years shows that this was not simply an outside perception disconnected from reality. It reflected something the people actually writing the show were aware of as well. Reese made another set of comments years later that connect even more directly to the specific comparison this video is built around, the comparison between The Simpsons and Family Guy. While appearing as a guest on a podcast called Simpsons Declassified, hosted by Nancy Cartwright, the voice actor who has played Bart Simpson since the show began, Reese brought up a specific piece of the show's history involving its opening credits. Every episode of The Simpsons begins with a sequence showing the family going about their day before ending with what is known as a couch gag, a short joke showing the family arriving in their living room and sitting down on the couch in some unexpected or unusual way. These couch gags became one of the show's most flexible running features, since the writers could change the joke every single episode without disrupting the rest of the story. Reese specifically discussed an episode from the show's fourth season called Lisa's First Word. Up until that point in the show's run, the couch gags had mostly stayed short and simple, usually just a quick one-time visual joke lasting only a few seconds, like the family accidentally sitting on the family dog, or briefly meeting another cartoon family in a quick visual reference. The couch gag in Lisa's First Word broke that pattern in a much bigger way. As the family arrives in their living room in the usual manner, the music playing behind them shifts into a more elaborate circus-like arrangement. Instead of simply sitting down, the family gets pulled into a much larger sequence, joined by a full chorus line and jugglers, with the walls of the room lifting away to reveal an entire stage production, complete with elephants, magicians, and fire breathers. It was a massive jump in scale compared to every couch gag that had come before it, turning a small recurring joke into a full-blown miniature spectacle. According to Reese, this specific couch gag from Lisa's First Word became something Family Guy borrowed almost directly for its own opening credits. Family Guy's intro follows a similar structure, showing the family, before ending with a big curtain reveal, built around a large stage-style production number rather than a simple, quick visual joke. Reese pointed out this similarity directly during his conversation with Cartwright, saying that The Simpsons had done that particular style of joke first, and that once Family Guy came on the air, its own opening credits ended up looking almost exactly the same, with curtains opening behind the family to reveal a big production number, very close in style to what The Simpsons had already done years earlier. Cartwright responded by joking that stealing from the best is simply what happens in this business, treating the comparison with some humor rather than outright anger. But the underlying point Reese was making stayed clear and direct. He believed Family Guy had taken a specific creative idea originally developed by The Simpsons and used it as the foundation for one of its own most recognizable features. This comment matters for a different reason than the earlier grandparent comparison. That first comment was about The Simpsons changing on its own, becoming crazier and weirder as the years went on, without necessarily connecting that change to Family Guy specifically. This second comment works in the opposite direction, showing a case where Family Guy borrowed something directly from The Simpsons, rather than the other way around. Taken together, these two comments from the same writer show just how tangled the relationship between these two shows really is. At times, critics argued Family Guy copied ideas that started on The Simpsons. At other times, critics argued The Simpsons started drifting toward a style of humor closer to Family Guy's own approach. Reese, someone who had first-hand knowledge of how The Simpsons operated from the inside for decades, ended up making comments that touched on both sides of that same ongoing argument. Reese was not the only person connected to the show whose comments touched on this larger debate. Al Jean, who shared the showrunner role with Reese during those early seasons and went on to become the primary showrunner for The Simpsons for the vast majority of the show's later years, also weighed in publicly on the relationship between the two shows, though his comments leaned more toward humor and light criticism rather than direct admission of decline. During an appearance at the Television Critics Association press tour, a regular event where television executives and producers speak with journalists covering the industry, Gene made a joking comment about a possible future crossover between The Simpsons and Futurama, another animated show that Gene also worked on as showrunner. His joke referenced doing a crossover with Scooby-Doo to find the body of Casey Kasem, a comment clearly meant as an offhand joke about how strange and unlikely certain crossover ideas can sound, rather than a serious announcement. While this particular comment was not directly about Family Guy, it shows that Gene was comfortable making public jokes about crossovers and about the strange territory long-running shows eventually wander into once they have been on the air for enough years. Gene's connection to the Family Guy comparison shows up much more directly in a different piece of the show's history. During the airing of the Treehouse of Horror 16 special, an annual Halloween-themed episode that The Simpsons has produced every year since its second season, the spooky opening credits sequence lists the names of everyone who worked on that particular episode using joke titles instead of their real job descriptions, a tradition specific to these Halloween episodes. In this particular version, Al Jean listed himself using the nickname Family Guy rather than his actual title. Because Gene had been openly critical of Family Guy's heavy reliance on cutaway gags in separate interviews around that same period, fans and critics widely read this credit as an ironic joke rather than a genuine compliment, a subtle jab dressed up as a strange piece of trivia buried inside the credits of a Halloween special most casual viewers would never think to pause and read closely. This detail matters because it shows Gene approaching the relationship between the two shows from a very different angle than Reese did, where Reese's public comments focused on direct creative comparisons, pointing out specific similarities between specific jokes and specific stylistic choices. Gene's contribution to this history shows up more as a quiet, embedded joke, something hidden inside the show itself rather than stated outright in an interview. Both approaches tell the same larger story from different directions. The people running The Simpsons during its most influential decades were clearly aware of Family Guy, aware of the comparisons being drawn between the two shows, and willing to acknowledge that awareness publicly, whether through blunt honesty during a college talk, through specific breakdowns of matching jokes on a podcast, or through small hidden references buried inside their own show's credits. It is also worth remembering how unusual it is for people working on a long-running television show to speak this openly about a rival series at all. Most television writers and producers tend to stay fairly guarded when asked about competing shows, often giving polite, non-committal answers designed to avoid stirring up unnecessary conflict or bad press. The fact that both Reese and Gene were willing to speak this directly about Family Guy, whether through comparisons, criticism, or inside jokes buried in their own credits, suggests that the relationship between these two shows carried real weight for the people actually working on The Simpsons, not just for outside fans arguing on forums and comment sections. When the writers who built a show start commenting on its evolution, using language that echoes exactly what outside critics have been saying for years, it becomes much harder to treat that criticism as simple nostalgia or unfair pessimism from disconnected fans. None of this means every person who ever ever worked on The Simpsons agreed with the idea that the show had drifted towards something resembling Family Guy. Plenty of writers and producers connected to the show have defended its later seasons in various interviews over the years, arguing that any long-running series naturally changes as new writers join the team and older ones move on to other projects. Reese and Gene's comments do not represent the entire writing staff speaking with one unified voice. What their comments do show is that even among the people most closely connected to the show's original creative direction, there was clear, direct acknowledgement that something had shifted, and that the shift was significant enough to bring up in interviews, podcasts, and even inside the show's own hidden jokes. This willingness to speak honestly from the inside adds an important layer to everything discussed so far. Outside criticism from fans and critics can always be dismissed as people simply growing older, changing their own taste in comedy, or looking back at childhood favorites through a rose-colored lens that makes everything from that period feel sharper and funnier than it may have actually been at the time. That kind of dismissal becomes much harder to make once the people who actually wrote the show start using similar language, whether that means comparing the show to an aging grandparent going crazy and weird, pointing out specific jokes that Family Guy borrowed directly from The Simpsons, or embedding a small, ironic nickname inside a Halloween special's credits. These comments, taken together, show that the connection between these two shows was never just something imagined by overly critical fans sitting outside the industry. It was something the writers themselves were actively aware of, actively discussing, and in some cases actively joking about, long before most casual viewers ever thought to examine the relationship this closely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That kind of awareness raises a bigger question. If the people writing The Simpsons were this comfortable joking about Family Guy and comparing specific jokes side by side, it is worth asking whether that connection ever went further than comments and interviews. The next part of this story looks at one person who did not just talk about both shows, but actually worked inside both writers' rooms directly. Section 5. When the writers' rooms started blending. Richard Appel spent 4 seasons working as a writer and producer on The Simpsons, joining the show during a period widely considered part of its strongest creative run. During those years, Appel worked directly alongside people like Al Jean, Mike Reese, and the rest of the writing staff responsible for building the show's reputation as one of the sharpest, most character-driven comedies on television. Being part of that writer's room for 4 full seasons means Appel was not a distant observer of what made The Simpsons work. He helped build it from the inside, sitting in the same room where scripts were pitched, torn apart, rewritten, and eventually turned into finished episodes. 4 seasons is a meaningful stretch of time in television writing, long enough for a writer to fully absorb a show's rhythm, its specific sense of humor, and the unwritten rules that separate what fits a particular series from what does not. At some point after his time on The Simpsons, Appel moved over to Family Guy, eventually rising to the position of executive producer on that show. This means Appel did not simply write a few freelance episodes for Family Guy on the side while working somewhere else. He became part of the leadership structure running the show, someone with real creative authority over the direction Family Guy took in its scripts, its characters, and its overall production. Very few people in television history end up holding senior creative positions on 2 shows that fans and critics spent years directly comparing against each other, arguing over which one copied which, and debating whether one show's decline pointed it toward becoming more like the other. Appel occupied that exact space, having helped shape The Simpsons during its celebrated years, and later helping steer Family Guy during its own run. This background becomes especially important once the story reaches 2013, when the idea of an actual crossover between the 2 shows started taking shape. According to reporting on how the crossover came together, the idea was first suggested while Family Guy's 13th season was being planned. Apple, using his position as an executive producer on Family Guy, brought the concept to Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, and received his approval along with some input on how the idea might work. From there, Apple needed something far more difficult to secure. He needed permission from the people running The Simpsons to actually actually use their characters in another show's episode, something that had never happened before in the exact way it was about to happen with Family Guy. This is where Apple's history on The Simpsons became the deciding factor in making the entire project possible. Apple approached Simpsons executive producers Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, and Al Jean directly, asking for their approval to move forward with the crossover. Because Apple had spent 4 seasons as a writer-producer on their show years earlier, he had already built a level of trust with these 3 people that an outside writer pitching the same idea almost certainly would not have had. Groening, Brooks, and Jean agreed to the crossover, and according to reporting on how the arrangement worked, the trust ran deeper than a simple yes to the initial pitch. The Simpsons side of the arrangement reportedly told Family Guy to go ahead and do whatever they wanted with the episode, saying they would simply watch it once it aired, rather than closely supervising the writing process themselves. That level of hands-off trust stands out sharply when placed next to an earlier crossover in Simpsons history that unfolded very differently. Long before Family Guy existed, The Simpsons had already done one crossover with another animated show involving a character named Jay Sherman from a short-lived series called The Critic, created by some of the same people connected to The Simpsons through the shared production company Gracie Films. That crossover appeared in a season 6 episode called A Star is Burns, where Jay Sherman travels to Springfield to judge a local film festival. Unlike the arrangement that would later happen with Family Guy, this earlier crossover caused real friction inside the show at the time. Several Simpsons writers reportedly complained that bringing in an outside character violated the integrity of their show, and Matt Groening was upset enough about the crossover that he had his name removed from the episode's credits entirely, a serious and public sign of disapproval from the very creator of the series. Word of Groening's frustration eventually became public knowledge, adding a layer of real behind-the-scenes tension to an episode most casual viewers at the time probably watched without any idea a conflict like that was happening. Placing these two crossovers side by side reveals just how much things had shifted by the time Family Guy came along years later. With the Critic crossover, outside involvement from another show created enough internal conflict that the creator of The Simpsons wanted his name taken off the finished episode. With the Family Guy crossover, Groening, Brooks, and Jean were reportedly comfortable enough to hand the entire episode over to another show's writing staff with almost no oversight at all, trusting that whatever came out the other end would be worth airing. The difference between these two reactions did not happen by accident. It happened specifically because Richard Appel was the person making the pitch the second time around, someone whose 4 seasons on The Simpsons had earned him enough credibility with Groening, Brooks, and Jean that they were willing to let their most famous characters be handled almost entirely by a separate creative team. The episode that resulted from this arrangement was called The Simpsons Guy, and it aired in September of 2014 as the season premiere of Family Guy's 13th season. Despite carrying The Simpsons name directly in its title, the episode was officially considered part of Family Guy's continuity rather than an episode of The Simpsons itself, meaning creative staff on both sides did not treat it as something that needed to fit cleanly into either show's ongoing canon. Because of this, Family Guy's writers were given free rein to handle the Simpson family however they wanted for the length of the episode, without worrying about whether specific jokes or plot points lined up with years of established Simpsons continuity. The plot follows the Griffin family taking a road trip that ends with their car getting stolen just outside Springfield, forcing them to stay with the Simpson family while they figure out what to do next. Peter Griffin, upon meeting Homer Simpson, becomes fascinated with him almost immediately, eventually developing an intense rivalry that culminates in a long, drawn-out fight between the two characters near the end of the episode, mixing in visual references to both shows' most famous physical gags along the way. The episode was written specifically by Patrick Meighan, a Family Guy co-executive producer, story editor, and writer, rather than being written by anyone from The Simpsons side. According to reporting on how the episode came together, Meighan pulled from familiar, established pieces of Simpsons history throughout the script, including smaller references like Bart making a prank phone call and using his well-known catchphrase, weaving pieces of Simpsons history directly into a story being told from Family Guy's creative perspective rather than Springfield's. Even though the writing came entirely from the Family Guy's side, the Simpsons producers were not completely absent from the process. According to reporting on the episode, executive producers connected to The Simpsons reviewed the script and made adjustments to a handful of specific lines before the episode aired, ensuring at least some level of input from people who understood the Simpson characters at their core, even while leaving the bulk of the writing and creative direction in Family Guy's hands. This small level of involvement shows that while Groening, Brooks, and Gene were comfortable handing over significant creative control, they still wanted a final check to make sure their characters were being handled in a way they could live with, rather than giving up all oversight completely. The animation side of the crossover carried its own direct connection between the two shows, separate from Richard Appel's involvement on the writing side. Peter Shin, who directed The Simpsons Guy, had previously worked as a layout artist on The Simpsons earlier in his career, giving him first-hand familiarity with how Springfield's characters were meant to move and look on screen. Because of this background, Shin paid close attention to small visual details when bringing the Griffin family into Springfield's world, including adjusting the whiteness of the Griffin characters' eyes so they would not stand out too sharply against the more muted, established look of Simpsons characters. Shin was also responsible for animating one of the episode's biggest and most demanding sequences, an 8-minute fight between Peter Griffin and Homer Simpson that became one of the episode's most talked-about moments once it aired. Just as Richard Appel represented a direct link between the two shows on the writing side, Peter Shin represented that same kind of direct link on the animation side, someone who had personally worked inside The Simpsons' visual style before helping bring that same world to life inside a Family Guy production years later. Behind-the-scenes discussions about the episode also reveal some interesting details about how seriously both creative teams treated the project once it moved from concept into an actual script. When the finished script was first read aloud to the Family Guy staff, Appel reportedly expressed concern about how long the episode had become, worried that it might be running longer than a standard episode could reasonably support. Seth MacFarlane responded by saying that Fox would likely be fine with extending the episode to a full hour if that is what the material called for, and the finished episode ultimately aired as a 44-minute-long special, roughly double the length of a normal Family Guy episode, giving the story enough room to properly introduce both families interacting with each other without feeling rushed. Before settling on the final story, Family Guy's writers reportedly pitched several different concepts for how a crossover might work. One idea involved the Griffin family staying with two background Simpsons characters, Lenny and Carl, without ever actually meeting the main Simpson family directly. Another far stranger pitch suggested that Family Guy's entire series could be revealed as nothing more than a figment of Ralph Wiggum's imagination, a wildly different direction that would have completely reshaped how audiences understood the relationship between the two shows. Neither of these ideas made it into the final episode, but knowing they were seriously considered shows just how much creative freedom the Family Guy writers had been given, to the point where even a concept as strange as erasing the show's own reality inside Ralph Wiggum's imagination was treated as a real possibility worth pitching. Voice actors from both productions had already crossed paths years before this official crossover episode ever aired. Dan Castellaneta, the voice of Homer Simpson, previously voiced Homer in a Family Guy episode called Ratings Guy, giving Family Guy's audience a direct glimpse of Homer's voice inside their own show's universe well before the two families officially met. Around a similar period, Seth MacFarlane himself voiced a character named Ben in a Simpsons episode from its 24th season called Dangers on a Train, meaning MacFarlane had personally lent his voice to an actual Simpsons episode before ever writing or overseeing the reverse crossover years later. Both shows had also referenced each other visually on separate occasions, including a small joke showing Peter Griffin's picture appearing inside a criminal lineup shown on an episode of The Simpsons, along with other quick visual nods scattered throughout both shows over the years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Richard Appel and Peter Shin both prove this connection went beyond friendly jokes and passing comments, since two real people with real creative authority carried their understanding of one show directly into the other. With that overlap established, The story now turns to the finished episode itself, and to what critics actually said once The Simpsons Guy aired and the two shows finally shared the same screen. Section 6. The crossover that confirmed everyone's fears. The Simpsons Guy finally aired on September 28, 2014, as the one-hour season premiere of Family Guy's 13th season, making it the 232nd episode of Family Guy overall. Both shows had already been airing on Fox for well over a decade by that point, with The Simpsons having premiered back in December of 1989 and Family Guy following almost 10 years later in January of 1999. That long shared history on the same network is part of what made a crossover feel almost inevitable to some fans, and yet the two shows had never actually met on screen in this kind of official, full-length way until this specific episode aired. The plot brought the Griffin family into Springfield after their car gets stolen during a road trip, forcing Peter, Lois, Chris, Meg, Stewie, and Brian to stay with the Simpson family for a few days while they figure out how to get home. From there, the episode built its story around the two families interacting directly, with Peter developing an intense fascination with Homer almost immediately after meeting him, eventually leading to a rivalry between the two that grows throughout the episode. Meanwhile, other pairs of characters from each family got their own smaller storylines running alongside the main plot, giving the episode a chance to show off how differently each show's characters behave when placed side by side. The guest voice list for this episode was extensive, bringing back nearly every major voice actor connected to The Simpsons to reprise their characters for this Family Guy production. Dan Castellaneta returned to voice Homer Simpson, along with several of his other regular characters, including Grandpa Abraham Simpson, Barney Gumble, and Krusty the Clown. Julie Kavner voiced Marge Simpson, as well as Patty and Selma. Nancy Cartwright voiced Bart Simpson, Maggie Simpson, and several side characters, including Nelson Muntz and Ralph Wiggum. Yardley Smith voiced Lisa Simpson, and Hank Azaria brought back a long list of his own characters, including Mo Sizlak, Apu Nahasapima Petalon, Chief Wiggum, and Comic Book Guy. The episode also folded in guest appearances from outside both shows entirely, including H. John Benjamin voicing Bob Belcher from Bob's Burgers, and Jeff Bergman voicing Fred Flintstone, adding even more crossover elements into a single episode already built around combining two separate universes. One notable absence from the reprisal list was Harry Shearer, the voice actor behind characters including Mr. Burns, Principal Skinner, and Ned Flanders, who did not return to voice any of his characters for this episode, meaning most of his usual characters either remained silent throughout the episode or were voiced by a different performer doing an impression instead. Once the episode aired, reactions split almost immediately into two very different camps, and this divide became one of the most talked about parts of the entire crossover. A piece covering audience reaction, published shortly after the episode aired, described the response as something people either loved or hated, with very little middle ground in between. Some viewers reacted with genuine excitement, describing the episode as outstanding, praising its production value, and comparing the experience to watching something closer to a movie than a normal episode of television. Other viewers reacted with the opposite intensity, describing the same episode as the absolute worst thing they had watched, with some longtime Simpsons fans specifically saying that watching the crossover reminded them why the Simpson family did not belong existing inside Family Guy's universe at all. This kind of sharply divided reaction, split almost evenly between enthusiastic praise and outright rejection, made The Simpsons Guy one of the more unusual crossover episodes in television history, since most crossover specials tend to generate a more uniform reaction, rather than pulling audiences apart this cleanly into two opposing camps. Critics writing more detailed reviews of the episode picked up on specific reasons behind this divide, rather than simply reporting that reactions were mixed. One widely read review argued that the crossover ended up exposing weaknesses in both shows, rather than showcasing what made each one strong individually. The review described the finished episode as feeling like a hastily assembled greatest hits collection, rather than a story built with real purpose, pulling together familiar elements from both shows, without necessarily finding a fresh reason to combine them. This same review pointed out that the two shows, despite being paired together constantly by casual viewers because of their shared network, shared time slot, and general family sitcom setup, actually work in very different ways underneath that surface. The Simpsons was described as character-driven, built around a careful balance between sharp humor and real emotional weight. Family Guy was described as unpredictable and loosely structured by comparison, relying more heavily on shock value and knowing references to hold its stories together, rather than the same kind of grounded character work. According to this critique, placing these two very different comedic engines into a single hour-long story did not necessarily bring out the best version of either one. The same review pointed directly at the episode's ending as a clear example of this problem. The Simpsons Guy closes with an extended fight sequence between Homer and Peter that blends two of each show's most famous recurring physical gags into one combined sequence. Family Guy has long featured a running joke involving Peter getting into repeated, increasingly absurd fights with a giant chicken named Ernie, usually destroying property across town in the process. The Simpsons has its own well-known physical gag tradition, most famously the moment where Homer, working as a safety inspector, decides to test how far he can jump his car across Springfield Gorge, resulting in Homer crashing partway through the jump and tumbling down the cliffside in a memorable sequence from the show's earlier seasons. The ending fight in The Simpsons Guy weaves these two separate pieces of history together, with Homer standing in for the chicken during a long, escalating brawl that eventually turns both characters into exaggerated superhero versions of themselves, sending the fight into outer space before bringing it back down to Earth and circling back around to reference Homer's failed jump and repeated fall down the gorge. According to the critique, this ending amounted to spectacle for its own sake, mixing two well-known bits from each show's history into something bigger and louder without necessarily making a stronger point than either bit made on its own the first time around. A separate, detailed review, published by a smaller entertainment blog shortly after the episode aired, took a more balanced view of the crossover, while still pointing out specific moments that bothered the reviewer. This review acknowledged up front that Richard Appel, having worked as a writer and producer on both shows at different points in his career, ended up overseeing an episode that came together more cohesively than the reviewer originally expected, especially given how tense the public rivalry between the two shows had been for years leading up to this crossover. Despite this overall positive framing, the review still singled out a handful of specific jokes it considered weak. One example involved a moment where Grandpa Simpson, after running over Peter Griffin, delivers a line insisting that he is the real victim in the situation, a joke the reviewer described as lacking subtlety in a way that echoed complaints already being made about later-era Simpsons humor more broadly. The same review also pointed to a few moments carried over directly from Family Guy's usual style of shock humor, including a crude visual joke pitched by Glenn Quagmire, and another moment involving Meg Griffin carving Lisa Simpson's name into her own arm, both described by the reviewer as extraneous gags that the episode could have easily cut without losing anything meaningful. Viewer reaction captured on social media around the time of the premiere reflected this same split almost perfectly, giving a real-time snapshot of just how divided the audience response actually was. Some viewers posted enthusiastic reactions immediately after the episode aired, calling the crossover funny, smart, and impressively produced, with a few specifically saying it outperformed that season's Simpsons premiere in terms of overall quality. Other viewers posted the opposite reaction within the same window of time, describing the crossover as strange in a negative sense, with at least one viewer joking that the crossover had never actually happened and encouraging others to simply move on from what they described as a bad dream. A number of longtime Family Guy viewers who admitted they had stopped watching The Simpsons regularly years earlier still reported enjoying the crossover, specifically because of how it blended in familiar Simpsons references for an audience that had drifted away from the show, while some Simpsons-focused viewers reported the reverse experience, saying the crossover reminded them exactly why they had given up on Family Guy in the first place. Beyond social media reaction and professional reviews, ordinary viewer reviews posted afterward showed a similar mix of reactions, though skewing somewhat more positive overall compared to the harsher professional critiques. Several viewer reviews described the episode as slow to start, before eventually eventually finding its footing once the two families actually began interacting directly, praising specific moments where the humor styles of each show blended together successfully. A number of these reviews specifically flagged the episode's level of violence and sexual content during the extended fight sequence at the end as being noticeably stronger than a typical Simpsons episode, with some reviewers noting that younger fans of The Simpsons specifically would likely find that portion of the episode too intense compared to the show they were used to watching. This detail lines up closely with earlier criticism of Family Guy's general approach to humor, since concerns about shock value and content aimed at an older audience had already followed the show since its earliest seasons, and having those same concerns show up specifically tied to Simpsons characters appearing inside a Family Guy production gave longtime Simpsons fans a very direct, visible example of exactly the kind of tonal shift some critics had been warning about for years. The numbers behind the crossover's popularity also tell part of this story. Data tracking file sharing activity around new episode releases showed a clear spike specifically tied to The Simpsons Guy, with peer-to-peer file sharing numbers for the episode reaching an all-time high compared to every other episode released across a 5-year tracking window covering both shows. This spike shows that curiosity about the crossover reached far beyond casual viewers checking in on live television, pulling in a wider audience actively seeking the episode out, specifically because of the crossover concept itself, separate from whatever their regular viewing habits looked like for either show individually. That said, this same tracking data also showed file sharing numbers for subsequent episodes that season dropping fairly quickly back down toward more typical levels, suggesting that whatever spike in attention the crossover generated was tied specifically to the novelty of the event itself, rather than reflecting a lasting jump in overall interest in either show going forward. Behind-the-scenes details about how the episode was structured also help explain some of this divided reaction. Because The Simpsons Guy was officially treated as a Family Guy episode rather than a joint production between two equal creative teams, the humor throughout leaned more heavily toward Family Guy's established style, even while spending almost the entire runtime inside Springfield, surrounded by Simpsons characters. This imbalance shows up clearly in how critics describe the episode. Reviews that focused on moments feeling true to The Simpsons tended to praise those specific scenes, while reviews that focused on moments carrying over Family Guy's usual shock-based humor tended to criticize those same scenes as feeling out of place next to Springfield's more grounded characters. This suggests that much of the disagreement among viewers came down to a fairly simple divide based on whether a given viewer walked into the crossover already more attached to one show's sense of humor over the other, since the finished episode genuinely did contain a mix of both styles, rather than leaning entirely toward either side. For the purposes of the larger question running through this whole video, The Simpsons Guy stands as one of the clearest, most concrete pieces of evidence connecting these two shows directly, precisely because it forced both comedic styles to exist inside the exact same 22 minutes turned 44 minutes of screen time. Every previous point discussed so far, from shared character structures to overlapping staff members to public comments from writers acknowledging the connection, existed somewhat separately from one another, spread across different interviews, different episodes, and different points in each show's history. This crossover pulled all of it together into a single finished product that audiences and critics could judge directly, side by side, rather than needing to compare things happening years apart across two completely separate productions. Whether a person walked away from the episode believing the crossover proved these shows had grown closer together over the years, or believing instead that the episode simply confirmed how differently they still operated underneath the surface, everyone watching came away with a clearer, more direct answer than any single comment from a writer or any single side-by-side comparison of matching jokes could have provided on its own. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The crossover showed what happens when both shows share one special hour, but it said little little about what was happening inside the Simpsons' own writer's room during its regular seasons. Answering that bigger question means looking past this single shared episode and back toward the actual content of Simpsons episodes airing on their own, tracking real changes in plot and joke construction across the years. Section 7. The gags got bigger, the plots got louder. One of the clearest ways to track how The Simpsons changed over the years is by looking at exactly how the show used celebrity guest stars, since this single detail shifted dramatically between the early seasons and the later ones. In the show's first several years, guest stars almost always voiced original fictional characters rather than appearing as themselves. The very first credited guest star on the show was Marcia Wallace, who joined the cast playing Bart's teacher, Edna Krabappel, a character rather than a real-world celebrity playing a version of herself. Wallace continued voicing Edna for well over 100 appearances across the years, becoming such a fixture of the show that her character felt like a permanent part of Springfield rather than a guest appearance at all. The shift towards celebrities appearing as themselves rather than voicing original characters started slowly. Singer Tony Bennett became the first guest star to appear playing himself, showing up briefly in a Season 2 episode called Dancin' Homer. From that point forward, more and more real-world celebrities began appearing as themselves rather than as fictional Springfield residents, and this trend grew heavier as the show continued into later decades. This distinction matters because voicing an original character asks a celebrity to disappear into Springfield's world, while playing themselves asks the show to build a joke specifically around who that famous person already is in real life, often leaning on their existing public image rather than actual storytelling. An early example of this shift shows up in the 11th season premiere, an episode called Beyond Blunderdome, which aired in September of 1999. The plot follows Homer attending a test screening of a movie starring Mel Gibson, playing himself, giving an honest negative review that catches Gibson's attention. Gibson, frustrated that everyone around him only offers praise, tracks Homer down specifically because Homer was willing to criticize him honestly, eventually flying Homer out to Hollywood to help fix the ending of his film. The episode leans almost entirely on audiences recognizing Gibson as a real celebrity and finding humor in seeing him interact directly with Homer, rather than building its comedy around an original character the way earlier seasons typically had. Looking back at this episode years later, some critics have pointed out how strange certain lines feel in hindsight, specifically a moment where Gibson complains that people love him so much they never criticize him, and a separate line where he jokes about never getting a speeding ticket from police. Comments that read very differently once placed next to Gibson's real-world legal troubles that became public years after this episode aired. This same pattern of leaning on real-world celebrities playing themselves continued to show up in episodes many years later, sometimes drawing even sharper criticism. A 2015 episode called The Musk Who Fell to Earth features Elon Musk playing himself, partnering with Mr. Burns on a business venture at the power plant. Critics reviewing this episode at the time already raised concerns about how the show handled Musk's appearance, particularly a moment where Lisa Simpson calls him the greatest living inventor, treating the guest star with a level of praise that felt closer to celebrity worship than to the kind of grounded, character-driven writing that built the show's reputation in earlier decades. Beyond individual celebrity appearances, a wider pattern shows up when comparing how the show handled pop culture parody across different eras. The Simpsons had always included parody as part of its comedy, even during its most celebrated early seasons. Episodes from those years built entire storylines around parodying classic movies and older cultural touchstones, including a Season 1 episode that parodies the war film Patton, and other early episodes built around spoofing films like Citizen Kane and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. These parodies worked because they were built around material that had already proven itself as culturally significant and lasting, giving the jokes a foundation that stayed funny and understandable even years after the episode first aired. Later seasons shifted this same instinct toward parodying whatever happened to be popular or trending at that specific moment, rather than reaching for older, more established cultural material. This shift brought its own set of problems, since jokes built around a very recent trend or a very recent piece of pop culture culture tend to lose their relevance quickly once that trend fades from public conversation. Combined with the fact that finishing a single episode of animation typically takes close to a year from the earliest planning stages to the finished broadcast, this created a real timing problem for the writers. A joke built around something considered current and exciting at the moment the writers first pitched it could easily feel outdated or forgotten entirely by the time the finished episode actually aired almost a year later. This same shift shows up clearly in how the show treated its celebrity guest stars from a writing standpoint. A widely used fan reference site that tracks ongoing criticism and audience reaction to the show describes a noticeable change beginning around season 17, arguing that some viewers began seeing the show as a softer, milder version of both Family Guy and South Park around this specific period, a period that also happened to line up closely with Family Guy returning to television after Fox had originally canceled it a few years earlier. This same source points to a heavier reliance on repeated plot structures, outdated pop culture references, and celebrity cameos as key reasons behind this perception, alongside a related complaint that character personalities, especially for Homer and Bart, had become less consistent, shifting depending on whatever a specific episode's plot required, rather than staying true to how these characters had been established over the show's earlier years. One episode frequently pointed to by critics and fans as a particularly clear example of this celebrity-focused shift is a later season episode centered entirely around Lisa meeting a pop star modeled after a real-world singer, with critics noting that the episode treats its celebrity guest almost like a saving, larger-than-life figure who solves the emotional problem at the center of the story. This stands in sharp contrast to earlier Simpsons episodes that dealt with similar emotional territory, involving Lisa feeling isolated or misunderstood. Episodes from the show's first two seasons that built their emotional weight around ordinary, relatable characters, rather than a famous guest star arriving to resolve Lisa's feelings from the outside. The overall pattern across all of these examples points toward the same basic shift discussed throughout earlier parts of this video, a slow movement away from grounded, character-based storytelling towards something built more heavily around spectacle, recognition, and outside references. Cutaway gags and pop culture parody had technically existed on The Simpsons since its earliest seasons, meaning this shift was never about introducing something completely new to the show. What changed was the balance, with later seasons leaning much more heavily on outside references and celebrity recognition to generate laughs, compared to earlier seasons where these elements played a much smaller supporting role next to strong character writing and grounded family conflict. This exact kind of imbalance, jokes built around outside recognition rather than jokes built around who a character actually is, sits at the very center of the criticism Family Guy has faced from its own critics for years. The same criticism covered earlier regarding its heavy use of cutaway gags disconnected from character or plot. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A much bigger, more direct example of this same tension already exists inside Simpsons history. At one point, the show did not just parody a trend from a distance, but poked fun at another specific animated series gaining popularity at that exact moment, and that show fired back with a parody of its own. Section 8. Springfield starts punching down at the new guy. On May 18th, 2025, The Simpsons aired the 18th and final episode of its 36th season, an episode called Stranger Things. It was written by Tim Long and directed by Matthew Nastuk, and it stood as the 790,000th episode in the show's entire history, a number that gives some sense of just how long this series has continued producing new material since it first premiered back in 1989. The episode also marked a notable behind-the-scenes change, since it was the first episode to feature Kelly MacLeod voicing Milhouse Van Houten, taking over the role after longtime voice actor Pamela Hayden retired from the part. The plot of A Stranger Things centers on Bart and Lisa's long-running habit of watching Itchy and Scratchy together, the extremely violent cartoon within the show that Bart and Lisa have shared as a bonding activity for years. The story kicks off when Marge shows the kids new Itchy and Scratchy merchandise made for babies, specifically aimed at Maggie. Bart and Lisa react with horror at the idea that their favorite show has been marketed toward infants, and both of them them immediately stop watching the cartoon together, ending a shared tradition that had defined part of their relationship as siblings. With that shared activity gone, Bart and Lisa each go their own way to find new entertainment, each picking up a tablet and searching for something new to watch independently. Lisa's new interest lands on a parody of the real-world sitcom New Girl, featuring guest voice performances from two of that actual show's real stars, Zooey Deschanel and Max Greenfield. Deschanel voices a character called Quirk Girl, a clear stand-in for her real New Girl character, Jess Day, while Greenfield voices a character called Schultz, matching his real-world role as the character Schmidt. Having the actual actors behind these characters return to voice parody versions of themselves added a layer of authenticity to the joke that a random impression from a Simpsons cast member could not have matched on its own. Bart's storyline goes in a very different direction. Instead of finding a parody of an established mainstream sitcom, Bart becomes fascinated with a show called Screaming Friends, watched entirely on his tablet. Screaming Friends is a direct parody of a real animated series called Smiling Friends, a surreal adult animated comedy that airs on Adult Swim, created by two former YouTube animators named Michael Cusack and Zach Hadel. The scene showing Bart engrossed in Screaming Friends became the most talked about moment from the entire episode almost immediately after it aired. In the scene, Marge looks over Bart's shoulder at his tablet and sees a chaotic-looking cartoon full of characters screaming, visually resembling the loud, abrasive style Smiling Friends is known for among its fans. Bart, completely unfazed by how strange the cartoon looks to his mother, tells her that while the jokes are great, what he really loves about the show is the storytelling underneath all the noise. This single line became a viral moment on social media within a day of the episode airing. Fans of Smiling Friends recognized the joke immediately as an accurate description of how audiences often react to their favorite show, since Smiling Friends has genuinely divided viewers between those who find its loud, chaotic style off-putting and those who appreciate the surprisingly clever storytelling hidden underneath that surface-level noise. By having Marge react with visible discomfort while Bart calmly praises the storytelling, The Simpsons managed to capture both sides of that real-world reaction inside a single joke lasting only a few seconds. Online discussion following the episode spread quickly, with one social media post asking users to share other examples of cartoons doing legally distinct parodies of other existing cartoons, gathering over 1,000 likes within a single day, and a separate post made specifically to a community dedicated to discussing Smiling Friends, pointing out that The Simpsons had actually been doing this kind of parody joke for years, well before this specific Screaming Friends moment. This detail about The Simpsons having a long history of joking about other cartoons connects directly back to everything discussed earlier in this video regarding Family Guy. The show has spent decades taking aim at other animated series, gaining popularity around it, sometimes affectionately, sometimes more pointedly, and the Screaming Friends joke fits into that same long-running pattern rather than representing something completely new for the series. What made this particular example stand out from past instances was simply how quickly The Simpsons managed to reference something as current and recent as Smiling Friends, a show that had only built up its cult following in more recent years, especially compared to the show's usual pace of parodying older, more established cultural material discussed earlier in this video. According to reporting on the episode, Cusack and Hadel, the actual creators of Smiling Friends, responded positively to the Screaming Friends parody once it aired, taking the joke as the kind of respectful nod that comes from one animated comedy acknowledging the influence and popularity of another, rather than an insult meant to tear the show down. Despite this positive reaction from the creators themselves, some corners of the Smiling Friends fan base online reacted less warmly, with certain fans expressing frustration that The Simpsons had chosen to represent their favorite show using an extremely narrow, exaggerated slice of its style, focusing entirely on the loud, screaming aspect of the show, while leaving out the more clever, deliberate storytelling that longtime fans of Smiling Friends actually value most about the series. The response from Smiling Friends itself came several months later in an episode called Squirm Returns, listed as episode episode 306 of the series. Inside that episode, one of the show's characters, Pim, is shown watching a cartoon on television that closely resembles The Simpsons. Though clearly redrawn in the same crude, exaggerated visual style Smiling Friends is known for using throughout its own episodes. The parody characters shown include a green-skinned version of the Marge stand-in with a wider purple beehive hairstyle instead of Marge's usual straight blue hair, along with versions of Bart, Homer, and Lisa redrawn in similarly distorted ways, including a version of Lisa holding a sign reading "No Fascism," seemingly poking fun at the way modern Simpsons episodes sometimes lean on very direct, on-the-nose political messaging. The parody Bart character in this scene, referred to online afterward using a nickname resembling his real name with a letter swapped, delivers a line referencing a piece of modern internet slang, seemingly aimed at mocking the way The Simpsons has occasionally worked recent internet culture references into its scripts as it tries to stay current with younger audiences. This exchange between the two shows, The Simpsons parodying Smiling Friends and Smiling Friends parodying The Simpsons back in return, mirrors almost exactly the same pattern discussed earlier in this video regarding the long-running relationship between The Simpsons and Family Guy. Both situations involve one animated show poking fun at another specific, well-known series, followed by that same series responding with its own parody aimed right back. The major difference this time is which side of that exchange The Simpsons occupied. In the Family Guy relationship, The Simpsons was typically cast as the older, more established show taking aim at a younger series widely accused of copying its format. In this newer exchange with Smiling Friends, The Simpsons finds itself on the opposite side of that same dynamic, now standing as the older, more established series being gently mocked by a newer show for leaning too heavily on loud chaos, trend-chasing references, and surface-level political statements rather than deeper storytelling, which is very close to the exact same criticism The Simpsons itself has aimed at other shows in the past. The behind-the-scenes production details around A Stranger Things add another layer worth understanding, especially regarding how quickly this particular reference made it to air compared to the show's usual pace. Because full episodes of The Simpsons typically take close to a year to move from initial planning through to final animation and broadcast, references built around very recent trends often risk feeling outdated by the time the finished episode actually airs, a problem already discussed earlier in this video regarding the show's general struggle with keeping pop culture references timely. The New Girl parody featured in this same episode is a clear example of that exact problem, since New Girl had already been off the air for roughly a decade by the time this parody aired, making the joke feel notably delayed compared to when the sitcom it was spoofing was actually part of the cultural conversation. The Screaming Friends reference to Smiling Friends stood out specifically because it managed to avoid that same delay, referencing a show that was still actively airing new episodes and actively building its fan base at the exact moment this Simpsons episode reached television, something that had become somewhat rare for the series given its usual slower turnaround time on cultural references. This was also not the first time in recent Simpsons history that Bart specifically had been used to reference a newer internet-based animator or creator. During the previous season, in an episode called Bart's Brain, Bart's dialogue included a reference showing his enjoyment of work made by Meat Canyon, a real-world animator who built a large following primarily through YouTube before expanding into other kinds of animated content. Having two consecutive season finales use Bart as a mouthpiece for referencing newer, internet-born animators and creators suggests a deliberate choice by the writers to connect the show more directly with younger online animation culture, an audience that grew up watching content very different from the network television landscape The Simpsons itself came from decades earlier. The viewership numbers for A Stranger Things tell an important part of this story as well, adding real context to how this episode fits into the show's much longer history. According to reported ratings figures, the episode earned a rating of 0.13 in its key demographic measurement and was watched by approximately 0.54 million viewers during its original broadcast, figures which made it the second most watched program on the Fox network that particular night. Despite that ranking, this viewership number represented the lowest rated episode in the show's entire history up to that point, a striking statistic for a series that once regularly attracted tens of millions of viewers during its peak years in the early 1990s. This steep decline in overall audience size does not necessarily reflect on the quality of any individual episode, since television viewing habits across the entire industry have shifted dramatically away from live broadcast viewing over the past several decades, with streaming services pulling significant portions of the audience away from traditional network television schedules. Still, the number stands as a clear marker of how much the media landscape surrounding The Simpsons has changed since its early years, a landscape that now includes creators like Cusack and Hadel building massive followings, first through free online platforms like YouTube, before ever working with a traditional television network at all, a career path that simply did not exist when The Simpsons first premiered in 1989. Critical reception of Stranger Things itself landed on the more positive side, despite these historically low viewership numbers. A review from Bubble Blabber, a website that regularly covers adult animated television, gave the episode a score of 7 out of 10, treating the Screaming Friends and New Girl parodies as clever, well-executed jokes, rather than lazy attempts to reference trending topics without real thought behind them. This generally positive critical response suggests that even as the show continues facing questions about its declining audience size and its complicated history of parody and pop culture reference, individual episodes can still land well with critics when the writers manage to find a joke that genuinely connects with a current cultural moment, as they seemingly did with the Screaming Friends sequence specifically. Taken as a whole, this entire exchange between The Simpsons and Smiling Friends offers a useful, more recent example of exactly the kind of dynamic explored throughout this video regarding Family Guy, but viewed from a completely different angle. Rather than looking backward at old interviews, old crossover episodes, or decades-old comments from writers about a specific rival show, this example shows the exact same pattern playing out again in real time, with The Simpsons now positioned as the long-running, established series facing gentle mockery from a newer show for many of the same reasons it once used to criticize Family Guy decades earlier. Whether this pattern says something meaningful about how The Simpsons itself has changed over the years, or simply reflects a long-running tradition of animated comedies affectionately ribbing each other regardless of which era they come from, depends heavily on how a person chooses to read this specific exchange. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. All of this leads back to a bigger question running through this entire video, one that goes beyond any single crossover, parody, or cameo. It means stepping back from individual examples and looking instead at what the people who have spent decades defending this show actually say when confronted directly with the argument that Springfield has drifted too far from where it started. Section 9. What the numbers and the writers actually say. Everything covered across this video, from the show's early influence on other cartoons, to the fan-led criticism captured under the label Zombie Simpsons, to former writers speaking honestly about the show's shift over time, to the crossover episode that put both shows side by side, to the more recent back and forth with newer animated series like Smiling Friends, all leads to one final and fairly obvious question. What do the people currently running The Simpsons actually say when asked directly whether the show has changed for the worse, and whether it has drifted towards something closer to Family Guy's style along the way? Unlike Mike Reiss, who mostly speaks about the show's history from the outside these days, Al Jean and Matt Selman have spent years answering this exact question directly, in real time, while still actively working on new episodes. Al Jean holds a unique position in this entire story. He joined The Simpsons as a writer during its very first season, sharing showrunner duties with Mike Reiss during seasons 3 and 4, before eventually returning to take over as the primary showrunner starting with season 13. a role he held for a long stretch of the show's history afterward. Because Gene has been connected to the series from its earliest days all the way through decades of later seasons, he has fielded more questions about the show's supposed decline than almost anyone else associated with the franchise. In one interview, given as the show approached its 34th season, Gene was asked directly about ongoing fan complaints regarding declining quality. Rather than dismiss the question outright, he responded by pointing out that audience expectations for what counts as good television have shifted significantly since the show's earliest years, meaning viewers judging older episodes against modern standards or modern episodes against nostalgic memories of the earlier years are not always making a completely fair comparison. He acknowledged that his own connection to the show makes it difficult for him to view it with total objectivity, but he pointed to the fact that the show had recently earned 2 Emmy nominations that same year, including a nomination for an episode he personally had very little involvement in writing, as evidence that newer material was still capable of reaching a high creative standard, in his view. Gene made a similar argument during an earlier interview, this time addressing the show's Emmy history directly as proof against the idea that quality had fallen off. He specifically referenced the show winning an Outstanding Animated Series Emmy for an episode that aired in 2019, arguing that if critics believed the show's overall quality had dropped, then the same argument would have to apply to the standards used by the Emmy voters who continued recognizing new episodes with major awards years after the show's celebrated early seasons had ended. He also made a more candid admission in that same conversation, saying that he believes it would be almost impossible for the current writing staff to compete directly against the show's own 4th season, adding that even an episode from that specific season, if aired today exactly as it originally was, likely would not receive the same praise from critics that it once did when it originally aired. This particular comment stands out because it shows Gene holding 2 ideas at once without treating them as contradictory. On one hand, he pushes back against the idea that the show has simply become worse, pointing to ongoing awards recognition as evidence that new episodes still meet a high bar. On the other hand, he openly admits that the 4th season represents a level of quality the current show cannot fully recreate, and that even that same 4th season material would likely be received differently by critics if it aired fresh today rather than decades ago. Taken together, this suggests Gene's position is less about denying any change happened at all, and more about arguing that comparing different eras of the show directly, without accounting for how audience expectations and critical standards have shifted over time, does not tell the whole story on its own. Gene has also spoken about specific creative choices that shaped the show's long-term direction, offering some insight into decisions that may have influenced the criticisms discussed earlier in this video regarding looser, more spectacle-driven plots. Speaking around the time the show reached its 800th episode, Gene reflected on the choice to avoid building one large, continuous storyline across the show's entire run, instead having each episode reset back to a familiar starting point, rather than carrying major consequences forward from one episode into the next. According to Gene, this choice played a significant role in allowing the show to continue running for as many seasons as it has, since a series built around one long, connected story would eventually run out of room to keep going, while a series that resets after each episode can theoretically continue almost indefinitely. This comment offers a direct, first-person explanation for part of the very pattern critics pointed to earlier in this video, the shift toward bigger, more disconnected, spectacle-style plots rather than storylines carrying real, lasting consequences. According to Gene, that structural choice was not an accident or a sign of declining effort, but a deliberate decision made specifically to extend the show's lifespan. Matt Selman, who eventually took over as showrunner after Gene stepped back from that role, has offered his own perspective on how the show approaches its material, particularly regarding the comparison to other current animated shows built around sharper, more immediate political and cultural commentary. Speaking around the time the show reached its 800th episode, Selman directly addressed the difference between The Simpsons and a show like South Park, which he specifically praised for its ability to react quickly to current events, thanks to a much faster production schedule. Selman explained that because Simpsons episodes typically take close to a year to fully produce, the show simply is not built to comment on breaking news or extremely current events the way a faster produced show can. Rather than treating this as a weakness, Selman framed it as a kind of creative freedom, saying that not needing to compete with shows built around fast, topical commentary allows The Simpsons to focus on a different kind of storytelling altogether, one centered more on values like empathy, community, and family, rather than direct political commentary on whatever specific event happens to be dominating the news cycle at any given moment. This comment connects, in an interesting way, to the earlier discussion in this video regarding celebrity cameos and pop culture references losing their relevance by the time an episode finally airs, given the show's slow production schedule. Selman's comments suggest that the current creative team is aware of this exact limitation and has chosen to lean into a different creative lane specifically because of it, rather than trying to force the show into a faster, more topical style it was never built to support in the first place. Whether that choice fully answers the criticism raised earlier regarding pop culture parodies feeling outdated by the time they air is a separate question, but it does show that the people currently running the show have thought carefully about where The Simpsons fits compared to newer competitors, rather than ignoring the comparison entirely. Selman has also directly defended some of the show's more unusual, continuity-bending creative choices in more recent seasons. During the premiere of the show's 37th season, an episode suggested that Marge experienced her teenage years sometime during the 1990s, technically making both Marge and Homer members of a much younger generation than audiences had generally assumed for decades, despite both characters remaining the same physical age since the show's original premiere in 1989. When asked about this shift, Selman explained that he was not concerned about disrupting a strict, consistent timeline for the characters, arguing that treating the show's continuity with total rigidity would only limit the writers creatively, and that keeping the show playful and willing to shift small details about the characters' backstories fits with what he considers the core identity of the series. He also estimated that only a small portion of the audience would likely be bothered by this kind of continuity shift, suggesting the creative team weighs decisions like this against how much it might actually matter to the show's overall viewership. Beyond direct responses to criticism, comments from Gene, Selman, and creator Matt Groening around more celebratory moments in the show's history reveal a consistent theme running through how the current team talks about the series. Speaking at an animation festival celebrating the show's continued run, Groening noted that fan enthusiasm for the series has only grown more intense over the years, rather than fading, a claim echoed by longtime director David Silverman during that same conversation, who pointed out that audience reaction at industry events had grown noticeably larger compared to similar appearances the team made over a decade earlier. Selman, during that same discussion, brought up the show's long-running habit of poking fun at its own heavy merchandising, noting that the series managed to sell enormous amounts of merchandise over the decades while also making jokes acknowledging how strange and excessive that same merchandising had become, a kind of self-awareness Groening traced back to some of the show's earliest episodes, including a joke about an extremely sugary fictional breakfast cereal that appeared on screen within the show's first couple of seasons. Taken together, these comments paint a picture of a creative team that does not deny the show has changed over the decades, but also does not accept the idea that this change amounts to a simple decline into something worse, or a straightforward drift toward copying Family Guy's specific style. Gene's comments acknowledged that the show cannot fully recreate its earliest seasons, while still defending later material on its own terms, backed by continued industry recognition. Selman's comments frame the show's slower pace and looser continuity as deliberate creative choices rather than accidental weaknesses, positioning The Simpsons as occupying a different creative space entirely compared to faster, more topically driven shows. Groening's comments lean into the idea that the show has always been aware of its own contradictions, capable of both selling merchandise and joking about that same merchandising within the same breath since its earliest years. None of this fully settles the original question running through this entire video, and it was never really going to. The claim that The Simpsons has drifted toward Family Guy's style rests on real, documented pieces of evidence, from the fan-led zombie Simpsons criticism to specific plot patterns shifting away from grounded family storytelling toward bigger, more disconnected spectacle, to writers like Mike Reiss openly acknowledging the show became crazier and weirder over time, to a direct crossover episode that placed both shows side by side for audiences to judge for themselves. At the same time, the people currently steering the show have offered their own real, direct answers to this same criticism, built around changing audience expectations, deliberate structural choices made to extend the show's lifespan, and a conscious decision to occupy a different creative lane than faster, more topical competitors. Both sides of this argument are built on real statements, real episodes, and real decisions, rather than pure speculation, which is exactly why this debate has continued for so many years without ever fully resolving in either direction. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What remains clear is that The Simpsons and Family Guy exist in a relationship far more tangled than a simple story of one show copying another, built on decades of borrowing, mocking, shared staff, and one shared screen. As both shows keep producing new episodes, that same debate will keep finding new evidence to argue over, one episode at a time. Section 10. What keeps Springfield running? The creative side of this story explains why fans and critics have spent decades arguing about whether The Simpsons drifted toward Family Guy's style. There is another side to this same story that rarely gets discussed alongside that creative debate, and it involves the business machinery that has kept The Simpsons running for close to 4 decades, long enough to become one of the most unusual entertainment properties in television history, regardless of where anyone stands on the argument about its quality. The scale of the show's run is difficult to fully grasp without looking at specific numbers. By the time the show finished its 30th season, it had produced 663 original episodes, a total that had already allowed it to pass Gunsmoke, a long-running television western that had held the record for most episodes of any scripted American series for decades, with 635 episodes to its name. Surpassing Gunsmoke made The Simpsons officially the longest-running scripted primetime series in the history of American television, a record that would only grow further out of reach for any future competitor as the show continued producing new seasons well beyond that milestone. By the time the show reached its 800th episode, it had been running for 37 seasons, a stretch of time covering roughly 4 decades of continuous production, an achievement almost no other scripted television series in history has come close to matching. The show's use of guest stars, discussed earlier in this video regarding celebrities appearing as themselves, eventually became significant enough to earn its own place in the Guinness World Records. As of April 2020, during the show's 31st season, The Simpsons held the record for the most guest stars ever featured in a television series, with a documented total of 810 individual cameo appearances counted up to that point, counting each guest star only once based on their earliest appearance on the show. This number reflects just how central celebrity guest appearances became to the show's identity over the decades, especially compared against the much smaller handful of celebrity cameos that appeared during the show's earliest seasons, when most guest voices were still being used to play original, fictional characters rather than themselves. This same record-keeping noted that one voice actor, Kevin Michael Richardson, actually began his time on the show as a guest star during its 21st season, before eventually becoming a full-time member of the regular supporting cast starting in the 28th season, showing that the line between guest performer and permanent cast member has occasionally blurred over the show's long history. Alongside this guest star record, The Simpsons has also built up one of the largest Emmy Award collections of any animated series in television history. As of September 2018, the show had earned 33 Emmy Awards specifically for its work in animation, a number that continued growing in the years that followed, including the win for an episode that aired in 2019 that Al Jean specifically referenced years later while defending the show against criticism, as covered earlier in this video. Beyond television awards, the franchise also picked up an Oscar nomination for a short film released in 2012. itself, a rare achievement for a television series to reach into feature film award territory through a spin-off project connected to its main show. The financial side of the show's history reveals just how valuable this level of longevity eventually became, especially once the ownership of the show itself changed hands entirely. The Simpsons was originally produced through 20th Century Fox Television, a studio that operated under the larger Fox Media Company for the vast majority of the show's run. That changed in 2019 when the Walt Disney Company completed a massive acquisition of 21st Century Fox, a deal reported at a total value of $71.3 billion. This acquisition folded several major entertainment properties into Disney's ownership at once, including the X-Men film franchise, the Avatar film franchise, and The Simpsons itself, transferring ownership of Springfield's entire television history over to Disney as part of one of the largest media acquisitions in entertainment industry history. Despite this massive change in ownership, the show's actual broadcast home did not shift as a result of the deal. Fox Broadcasting Company, the network that continues airing new Simpsons episodes on live television, was structured separately from the assets Disney purchased, meaning The Simpsons kept airing on the same network it always had, even while its production company and back catalog became Disney property. This acquisition brought The Simpsons into a completely new phase of its business life, one built around streaming rather than simply live broadcast and syndicated reruns. Following the completion of the Disney deal, the show's entire back catalog became available for streaming through Disney Plus, introducing decades of episodes to viewers who may have grown up with none of the same cultural memory of the show's original broadcast run during the 1990s and early 2000s. According to comments from longtime director and producer David Silverman, given shortly after the acquisition was finalized, Disney had been supportive of keeping the show's tone and content intact, rather than pushing for major changes to make it fit a more family-friendly image typically associated with the Disney brand, despite The Simpsons containing plenty of material that would not traditionally be considered appropriate for very young children. Reporting from before the Disney acquisition was finalized also sheds light on just how valuable the show had become purely as a financial asset, separate from any ongoing creative discussion about its quality. Around the time the acquisition was first being negotiated, reporting indicated that Fox and its studio were finalizing a renewal deal to continue the show for 2 additional seasons, but under a licensing arrangement that reduced the fee paid to the studio compared to previous renewal agreements, reflecting how the economics surrounding a show this old had shifted over time. At the same time, reporting also pointed to significant financial value sitting inside the show's massive existing catalog of past episodes, suggesting that even if the series eventually stopped producing new episodes altogether, the decades of already completed material would likely remain a valuable asset for whichever company owned the rights to license and stream it going forward. One additional piece of the show's history connects directly back to the earlier discussion in this video regarding fan criticism and the Zombie Simpsons label. According to comments from creator Matt Groening, given during an interview reflecting on the show reaching its 800th episode, the character of Comic Book Guy, a perpetually dissatisfied nerd character who runs a comic shop in Springfield, was created as a direct response to a specific kind of criticism the show started receiving once internet fan communities began forming around it. Groening explained that as internet message boards grew during the show's earlier years, a certain type of fan began appearing who would declare nearly every new episode the worst episode of the series so far, regardless of the episode's actual content. Comic Book Guy, known for his exaggerated, joyless nitpicking of pop culture and his tendency to dismiss things instantly with a flat, sarcastic tone, was built specifically as a piece of self-aware commentary on that exact kind of fan behavior. Groening noted that he personally welcomes genuine analysis and criticism of the show, but finds it frustrating specifically when criticism amounts to nothing more than a blanket dismissal calling something not funny or boring without any real reasoning behind it. This detail adds an interesting layer to the entire Zombie Simpsons discussion covered earlier in this video. The kind of fan behavior Groening described, reflexively calling every new episode the worst one yet, closely resembles some of the harshest language used by fans and critics associated with the Zombie Simpsons label, language language that described the modern show using words like hollow and mediocre. Knowing that the show's own creator was aware of this exact pattern of criticism early enough to build an entire character around mocking it shows that this tension between the show and its most critical fans is not a recent development tied only to arguments about Family Guy, but something that has existed in some form since internet fan culture first began forming around the series decades ago. Groening also spoke about one of the earliest creative decisions made regarding the show, a decision that ended up shaping everything that followed regarding its tone and its willingness to push boundaries. According to Groening, when Fox executives first asked whether the show was meant for children or for adults, the creative team made an immediate and firm decision that it was being made for adults. Groening described this as one of the most important choices made in the show's entire history, since deciding early on that the audience was adults rather than children gave the writers room to explore a much wider range of jokes and subject matter than a show explicitly built for children ever could have attempted. Taken together, these business details and behind-the-scenes reflections add real weight to the creative debate covered throughout the rest of this video. The show's massive size, its record-breaking episode count, its record-breaking guest star total, and its place inside one of the largest media acquisitions in history all point to an entertainment property that succeeded on a scale most television shows never come close to reaching, regardless of where any individual episode or season lands in the ongoing quality debate. At the same time, knowing that the show's own creator built a character specifically mocking reflexive online criticism, and knowing that the earliest creative decision to target an adult audience shaped everything that followed, shows that many of the tensions discussed throughout this video between creative ambition and fan expectation, between longevity and consistency, and between staying true to an original vision while still trying to stay relevant decades later, have been part of the show's story since long before Family Guy ever entered the picture at all. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.